Well, welcome back. This is the third of 6 videos that are looking at Chapter 5 of Wheeler's Most Excellent Book. In fact, this one is actually, I'm not looking at the book, but one of the supplemental readings that goes with this particular course. And so what we're doing is we're going and looking at information security analysis. And if you go and read this paper that's linked off the course website, you can see the thesis there that they're trying to use qualitative and quantitative analysis on how resources are allocated and what threats and risks are chief information security officers looking at. And their idea is that information security risk analysis is this non-holistic form of risk management. We want to reduce negative impact of breaches, and the best way to do that is to go out and kind of survey the field, find out what's going on, and they try to differentiate that between information security, those procedures, processes, personnel, and technology for protecting an organization. If you link that back to the Macomber Cube, the technology, policy, and education training awareness is kind of the same thing. They just use people or personnel as part of that definition. As we look at risk analysis, it follows a very common methodology that you should be getting comfortable with, this idea that we have to identify what the assets are, do a threat assessment, do a vulnerability assessment, look at our safeguards. They use the word safeguards here. It's the same as controls, which is what we've been using previously, and then that leads to a risk assessment in the organization. As they look at different mechanisms for doing this, they listed 4 that are out there. And you'll see in a couple of slides that the survey results show that there's limited use of these, really with the dominant use being of the annualized loss expectancy or single loss expectancy. And then there's some advantages and disadvantages associated with these different approaches. So what they did is they created a survey, sent it out to about 300 chief information security officers. Of those, about 10% or 32 responded, and these are going to be the results from that. So again, a pretty interesting read in terms of who responded, and then the subsequent slides, which we'll get into, will help highlight the kind of findings. So you can see that about a quarter of these are coming from very large companies, more than 15,000 employees. A quarter are in that kind of mid-size, 2,500 to 7,500 employees, and then the remainder are principally in smaller companies. Good mix of different disciplines out there, with the largest being financial, banking, and insurance, consulting, information technology, and manufacturing being large shares, and then everything else is spread into kind of smaller slices of the pie. Most of these were listed as technical, scientific, or professional positions, but again, you get a mix there. The experience within the security professionals, for the most part, was between 6 and 10 years, although you got a smattering of those that are 11 to 15 or 16 to 20. You did not have the most junior 5 or less responding to the survey in any sizable amount. Actually, it looks like 1 out of 32 or something close to that. The same with, that's IT experience, and then the security experience, same thing, about 6 to 10 is the sweet spot there. Now we start getting into looking at these risk factors, and you're kind of getting into your organization. What are you focusing on when you're looking at risk? And some pretty interesting things here. So the dominant answer was financial losses. The second dominant answer by a little bit was risk to infrastructure, but followed pretty closely by reputational damage and regulatory requirements. And so all of these are fairly straight, they're all in a pretty tight band. All of these things come into play, which kind of reinforces what we've been talking about within the book. Not surprisingly, only about 15% of the organizations calculated a return on investment, and only about 28% transfer risk in the form of purchasing insurance. And so again, that's interesting. Again, not surprising. And this is why risk management and information security are such robust fields. If you're not calculating a return on investment, you're not doing, the kind of core principles that you would find in HR or finance or typically in IT organizations. And so there's a lot of room to grow and to get process maturity in those fields. Same with insurance. It is relatively new to purchase cyber insurance, but again, you would think perhaps more widespread adoption of one of the principal ways of managing risk. As you come back and look at who's involved with this, again, the not surprising, IT is heavily involved. The other managerial are only involved in 2/3. The CEO and the CIO, lesser involvement, and then the owner or partner of the organization, pretty low involvement. You would imagine that, again, this would change over time as security becomes increasingly important in the organization. As you look at who has final approval authority, it's relatively high, but again, maybe that's right. Maybe the CEO and CIO are the appropriate approval level for that. But you can see some of that at lower levels. When you get in and look at their loss exposure and they look at where they're spending money to do risk assessment and to do use audit methodologies, I would think you see that this is the kind of normal mix that you would have in a more traditional kind of setting. I'm really not surprised on this. I'm a little bit surprised that 59% of people are still doing war dialing. I guess it is an attack. It's just not a very common one. But it gives you a sense of the depth and breadth that these organizations and the high conformity is the right word in terms of what they're looking at. So all of these things are being viewed and used as part of looking at where there may be vulnerabilities within the organization and things that they may need to do to limit their risk exposure. Going down below, again, not surprising, consultants are used a great deal to help within this. You've always got to be careful there. The other 3 techniques that are pretty heavily used on this, or I guess 4 techniques, if you do a little bit of grouping. We'll start with the most dominant, and that's this idea of Delphi technique and brainstorming. Great approach for actually doing this. Not surprising that it's got about an 81% adoption rate within the organization. You see a 78% use of consultants, a 75% use of single loss expectancy questionnaires and surveys, and then the others kind of begin to trail off in terms of their adoption. So those other mechanisms that we reported earlier, the more advanced mechanisms, you see much lesser adoption of those methodologies. Hopefully you'll learn some things in this book that you can bring forward and use and that would complement what is being done within the Chief Information Officer or Chief Information Security Officer realm and their different approaches. So the benefit of this paper is it kind of does this kind of first survey looking at information security risk analysis and looking at the different mechanisms that are out there. Lots of different holes in there, but it gives you a sense of the maturity of the field, and that's why I included it in the course. You want to have a sense of where people are, what techniques they're using, what you should look for as you're going out, and hopefully we'll see additional mechanisms of collecting this information. Well, this brings us to the end of this particular video. What we're going to do in the next video is start looking at expected loss and expected loss calculations. Again, the material here covers Chapter 5 of the Wheeler book. We're on one of the additional readings now. And actually, the next couple of, we're going to cover 2 more papers as we look at risk and how we manage risk. So keep on studying, keep on learning, and I'll see you in the next video.